Ladies and gentlemen, greetings to you all. Welcome to the Impact webinar, Unlocking CCUS Landscape in Asia Pacific. My name is Betty, content producer at Leader Associates, and it is my great honor to be your host for today's session. From facilitating blue hydrogen production to achieving negative emissions from biomass energy, CCUS is an important tool for reducing carbon emissions. This is especially true in heavy industries that rely on fossil fuels, such as steel and cement manufacturing. According to the forecasts, the Asia-Pacific region is expected to account for over 60% of future CCUS emissions reductions by 2050, and more than 3 billion tons per year. This webinar aims to analyze the current CCUS market, opportunities, and challenges in Asia-Pacific region, provide strategic perspectives on potential cooperation between the regions, and experience sharing of world-leading countries. This webinar is a digital part of our physical gathering, Carbon Capture APAC 2024, taking place from July 9th to 10th at Pan Pacific Hotel, Melbourne, welcoming over 500 industry enthusiasts. This extraordinary event presents an unparalleled opportunity for you to forge strategic partnerships in the thriving APAC CCUS industry. With early confirmed speakers include Government of Australia, Government of Norway, Government of Japan, Government of Malaysia and Sarawak, as well as Chevron, JERA, Petronas, and with many more to be announced. In today's session, we will divide it into two parts. In the first part, we will delve into unlocking the emerging CCUS landscape of Asia Pacific with Rystad Energy. In the second part, we will discuss about the Australia-Japan CCUS value chain, the role of Japan in advancing CCUS development, and experience sharing from world-leading project, Northern Lights, and UK government. Before we start, please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared online. We encourage active participation in the Q&A sessions following each presentation. Now, let's move on to our first part brought by Ms. Sohini Jaggi, CCUS Low Carbon Senior Market Analyst, and deliver her presentation, Unlocking the Emerging CCUS Landscape of Asia Pacific. Dear Ms. Sohini, the stage is now yours.
Yeah. So today, our topic of discussion is unlocking the emerging CCUS landscape that is quite evidently prominent in the Asia Pacific. So the first topic that we will discuss today is where the overall CCUS market lies in the region. So let us start with some macro numbers in terms of what has been registered in the Asia Pacific landscape. So if we see here, this is the overall cumulative CO2 capture capacity that is announced on a global scale. And what for understanding, we have split it across the region in which they are registered. So as of today, overall Asia Pacific, that is a combination of Asia as well as Australia, comprises close to 20% of the global commercial CO2 capture capacity. Although as evident, this is still majorly led by North America and Europe. But over the last 1 or 1.5 years, we have seen a significant growth in terms of companies getting a lot of traction in announcing new projects from different sectors, from carbon offset to carbon removal. And that has kind of enhanced the overall landscape, with comprising close to 20% from being less than 10% to early 2022 to close to 20% locking in as of the current date. But just to give you an overview, the market majorly expanded over the last 1 year. In fact, if we look into 2023 from Asia Pacific landscape, this was the record year with the single highest year announcement of new capacity across the region, from East Asia to South Asia to Southeast Asia to Australia. And in fact, if we see in the last 3 years, which is majorly pre-2021, 2021 or 2022, 2022, where this figure kind of gives you an analysis of the count of projects that is associated with the capacity that we showed in our past slide. The growth has been mostly sluggish, but in the last 1 year, it's almost close to 100% growth in new projects. And it is majorly led by East Asia. So when I say East Asia, this is China, South Korea, and Japan, followed by South Asia, which is again majorly India. And then we have Southeast Asia, which is again majorly Malaysia and Indonesia. And then we have Australia. The strategy the companies are deploying in going ahead with the CCS landscape is quite different. And it is not just the corporate strategies that we would say have led to such growth in CCUS project, but a major role has been from the regulatory aspect as well. Like, for example, the amended safeguard mechanism that was announced in Australia last year that puts a compliance or mandate on the emissions exceeding 100,000 tons per annum, including sectors like oil and gas, etc. That has actually led to announcement of new projects in the oil and gas sector, what we saw emerging in Australia, but also, for example, the newly announced CCS regulation in Indonesia that addresses a lot of aspects with respect to national CCS as well as cross-border aspect. Or, for example, announcement of being able to materialize cross-border CCS projects in cross-border exporting of CO2 in Australia. So from the regulatory aspect as well, we definitely saw a significant amount of momentum. And in fact, there were also $1 million funding announcement that we saw was done in Japan, South Korea announcing specific CCS targets by short term, etc. And that has actually been a major booster for growing this space, in addition to the corporate strategy space that we saw was one of the initial drivers for CCUS in the region. If we look more into the strategies, as I mentioned previously, it definitely varies. For example, if we look into China, it is more focused on developing national CCS space with capture, transport, storage, more localized within the country, onshore or offshore. Or, for example, if we look into South Korea and Japan, they are chiefly looking into cross-border export of the carbon dioxide from their emitters in their countries because of the limitation that they have with respect to CO2 sequestration. Or, for example, if we look into same with Southeast Asian countries like Indonesia or even Malaysia, in addition to developing national CCS space, they are also focused in aiding for developing as a carbon storage hub for the cross-border emitters, for example, South Korea, Japan, Singapore, etc. And then when we talk about Australia, it is more on a hybrid concept. They are also looking into national CCS space, but also cross-border opportunities, attracting Japan, South Korea, etc. So we see the strategies are varied, but all in all, it has enhanced the overall landscape of CCS space quite magnificently. Now, if we look into more about some of the key emerging trends in APAC, it has a very contrasting trend to a global landscape, especially in terms of the kind of operators or the companies that are involved in leading the CCUS project. So to give you an understanding, we have shown here the statistical representation of the count of CCUS projects in APAC, split by the type of companies that is leading it. And as evident, this is majorly led by the energy or oil and gas companies across the value chain that has the most amount of projects. This is quite in contrast to the global landscape, because if you would have looked into a very similar statistics on a global level, this is chiefly led by non-energy companies like industrials, research bodies, as well as power utility companies. But when we talk about Asia Pacific, this we see is majorly the energy portfolio, whether it's INOCs like PetroChina, Petronas, Pertamina, integrated companies like Santos, etc., but also energy majors. In fact, all of the 6 energy majors are involved in some or the other CCUS project in the overall Asia Pacific. And over the last 1 year, it has been quite evident that one of their strategic moves that they are looking into developing the CCUS space is Asia Pacific. So whether we talk about China, where we have seen ExxonMobil or Shell announcing hub-scale projects, or for example, in Southeast Asia, like Total Energies, Shell, ExxonMobil, BP, partnering with the local players in forming permanent storage projects, or further south in Australia. So they have been expanding their footprint throughout the region. And this is also one of the very evident statistics that we are seeing rising up, which is, as I say, contrast to the global statistics. Now, since we saw that the main portfolio of the CCUS projects lie with the energy or oil and gas companies, therefore, it was very evident that certain key sectors within the value chain of CCS would be more prominent compared to the others. So in that respect, what we have shown here is the statistical capacity analysis of the CCUS capacity in APAC. On the left, split by the type of carbon source. So majorly focused on the upstream part of the CCUS space. And as evident, this is majorly led by energy. And when I say energy, this is majorly the LNG, oil and gas production, etc., but also industry. And in industry, this is majorly led by blue hydrogen production through steam methane reforming, which is majorly led by gas. Which is dominant. And therefore, in line with the operator's portfolio in the APAC region, the kind of industry also remains in par. However, if we look into the later half of the decade, especially 2030 onwards, we are going to envisage some significant amount of capacity led from power generation facilities. And when I say power generation, this is majorly gas power, biopower, as well as coal power. But just to give you a perspective here, this is not representative of the entire Asia Pacific as of today. Yes, the amount of decarbonization the power sector still needs from the CCUS space in APAC is quite massive, but with respect to that, it is still quite insignificant. And this is chiefly what the capacity that you see here is majorly laid by some of the countries like China, India, etc. So not representative of the entire region. Whereas when we talk about energy, or may say even hydrogen production in the industries, this is representative of what we see common across the region, from Australia to East Asia to Southeast Asia to South Asia. Similarly, on that part, if we now look into the downstream part of the CCUS space, which is majorly the storage or the end use, what we are seeing is very evident across the years, irrespective of timeline, is a major focus on permanent storage. And when I say permanent storage, this is across oil and gas fields and saline aquifers, majorly focus on sedimentary rocks. So this continues to drive the elephant share of capacity because of certain advantages it holds, mainly with respect to the amount that can be sequestered, as well as realizing the permanent end fate of the captured CO2. And this is comparatively significant if we look into others, like for example, enhanced oil and gas recovery. Although yes, some amount of capacity is still going to be led from hydrocarbon recovery, but because of certain limitations, it still stays insignificant to permanent storage. And then the third part, which is utilization. When I say industrial utilization, which is the end use of using CO2 in certain industrial application, this also remains comparatively insignificant. Although over the past year, we have seen certain projects being announced that are focusing on using CO2 for producing certain valuable products like chemicals, fuel production, etc. But still comparatively in terms of CO2 capacity remains insignificant to permanent storage. Therefore, in line with the type of operator's portfolio, the strategy that they're applying in the CCS landscape is also completely in parse. Now, moving a bit further, we talked about all these projects, right? Now, if we look into more on the distribution of projects, so this is the map that showcases the Asia Pacific projects that I have been talking about. And as you can see, starting from East Asia to Southeast Asia to Australia, the distribution of projects have been quite significant. Just to give you an overview, this is split by their current status of what they are lying. And therefore, if we see here, although yes, it is a very significant portfolio of projects that lies here, but most of them, which is approximately 70% of these projects, they still are in their very early phase, which means in their planned feasibility or FEED studies, or even in proposed phase, which is with only 10% of the projects close to that is under development that has completed their FID, only 7% being operational, and 7% are cancelled, abandoned, completed, or suspended. Therefore, definitely a very ambitious portfolio of projects with ambitious startup years in the next 3 to 4 years. But having said that, they are still in their extremely early phases, which means that there could be a significant amount of risks that could emerge, and something that needs to be taken care of for the smooth timeline of the project. And therefore, this is going to be our base for our next topic that we are going to discuss is what are the key risks that are emerging in the APAC CCUS space. But before that, we go deep dive into the Asia Pacific. Let's start again from a more global perspective, because the risks remain similar. Of course, it's a combination of one or two reasons or more that drives it, but in all, the reasons are pretty much similar. So if we analyze the upcoming CCUS project space based on what we have done in Rystad, approximately 34% of the global upcoming CCUS projects are on verge of facing deferrals or delays from their originally stipulated timeline. Now, if we look into the distribution of the different reasons, it is a combination of majorly three factors that is driving the space. One is project development, which means different kind of delays that a project faces across the timeline of its feasibility, FEED studies, not able to secure enough offtake agreements, looking for storage or utilization, etc. The second emerging reason is deferral in permit approval or acquisition, and which combines 26% of the global delayed projects. And this is something that has been quite prominent over the last 1 year, where we have seen that companies either they are delayed getting the permits for storage or transportation, or they are rejected the permit, or they are not being able to get the approval on time. It can be varied, but this is one of the mandatory requisites for a project to actually go ahead, but something that is quite on deferral and therefore is likely to delay the timeline of projects. The next is economics, which is basically determining the financial business case of the CCUS project that they're looking into, which can be either not being able to get enough funding from the government, not able to get registered under the tax credit, not able to develop the financial scheme of the CCUS plan a company is looking for, etc. And then other regulatory concerns, like, for example, court denying the permits, additional permits on top of transportation and storage, other socioeconomic reasons, like, for example, environmental protests, or even change in strategies of the companies looking for projects that can actually are likely to delay the projects quite significantly. And this is something that I say is very much relevant to the Asia Pacific landscape as well. Although, just to give you an overview, we saw right in our past slide that more than 70% of the CCUS projects in Asia Pacific is right now in very early phase, which means that they still have not reached the phase where they would be applying for the permit, or they would be determining the exact financial business case of their project. And therefore, although not right now, but these are some of the reasons that could actually cause the delay of the CCUS ventures in Asia Pacific as well. To give you an example on the permit thing, because as I mentioned, permitting is one of the key factors that can actually delay the projects very significantly, and the delay can be actually quite huge. So when we talk about permits, it can be either for transportation or it can be for storage. Just to give you an example on what an impact a permit can have on, say, an infrastructural route. So this is an example of one of the largest CCUS project in United States onshore, which is the Summit Carbon Solutions led BECCS project, which was supposed to collect carbon dioxide from multiple emitters across the multiple states in United States, followed by transportation and storage somewhere here in North Dakota. But being denied the permit for the pipeline multiple times had actually led to the company to delay and reject the project, and therefore this is something that they are not going ahead for, and this has actually put them in a condition where it can actually even cause cancellation of the project, if not delay by at least 5 to 6 years. So we can see that what an impact permit can have from the infrastructural perspective or from storage. But on top of that, this is what not getting a permit on a time or being rejected the permit. What about having enough permits from the government to apply for? This is also something that can actually lead to delays or deferrals and can cause to a lot of issues to the upcoming project. To give you a perspective around that, on what an impact the supply from the government in terms of having permits is important, is what we have shown in this slide with the example of Australia. So we know, right, when we talk about permanent storage of carbon dioxide, it's important that companies apply for a permit from the government, and only once they can get from the permit from the government that they can actually go ahead with the injection of carbon dioxide. But if we look, say, for example, in Australian landscape, where we have shown here the statistics of the upcoming CCUS projects in Australia, split by 4 categories. The first category, which is the gray shaded one, are the projects which has got the permit awarded. So therefore well and good that they already have the license with them. And then comes the second list of projects marked as dark blue, which are estimated to be awarded the CO2 permit based on the current list of permits that are on offer from the government but yet not awarded. But then on top of that comes this list of projects which are marked as light pink and dotted red, which is basically the deficit or the additional demand that needs to be compensated if they want to go ahead with their project. But right now, as of the current scenario of the permits on offer or the plan of the government, this is still a deficit that lies, which is something that needs to be adjusted. Therefore, there should be a good balance between the supply and the demand in terms of permits as well, that also is likely to play a key role in keeping the projects on time. For example, if we look into these projects that are going to materialize in 2028, we are already in 2024, which means the next 1 year is going to be extremely crucial for these projects to acquire the permits from the government, and only then they can go ahead with the rest of the studies that is necessary for them to take the FID and then take the finally start with the construction. And if they're not able to get the permit, which can be also from the government aspect, that the permits are not available in the market, they can actually cause delay to the projects. And therefore is seen one of the key risks and challenges that can emerge in the other parts of Asia Pacific as well. So on that note, to summarize this part on a more constructive way, based on the risks that we have seen materializing and the risks that are likely to materialize in the upcoming years, based on Rystad Energy scorecard analysis, we have segregated the announced capacity in Asia Pacific, split by 5 broad components. The first is operational capacity. This is something that has already been started up and therefore definitely is not part of the risk analysis. And then on top of that comes grade A, which is basically the capacity that has reached FID and therefore definitely has comparatively lesser risk to start up because the financial decision has already been taken. But on top of that comes the 3 segments. The first is the yellow segment, which is grade B. So this is the capacity that comprises of the projects that are close to taking their FID, yet but with having a convincing business financial case as well. But as of today, they haven't yet secured all the regulatory permissions, the other aspects and financial aspects that needs to be mandatorily secured before going ahead with the project, and therefore bears some amount of risk along with that. And then on top of that comes grade C and grade D. So this is basically the main uncertainty that we are likely to see in the Asia Pacific landscape. These are the projects that are in extremely early phase, but having very ambitious startup years in the next 3 to 4 years. But neither they have a firm planning out of their project, neither they have a proper business scheme or the financial scheme that has been established, or neither they have been able to secure contracts with respect to the service providers, etc. And therefore, they definitely bear massive amount of risks, which if not resolved or taken care of in the next 1 year with respect to regulatory or financial schemes, or even developing the overall economic scheme of the project, is likely to delay from their timeline, and it can actually lead to certain amount of suspension, or in extreme dire cases can even lead to cancellation. And therefore, this is something that needs to be taken care of, especially in the next 1 or 2 years, to keep them on track or on time. Okay. So with that, I come to the end of my second module. So before I go to my third module, maybe we can take up some questions and discuss them.
Thank you so much for your instructive presentation. And here we've got some questions from our audience. And the first question is, how will policies and governments shape the growth of the CCUS in Asia Pacific?
Thank you for the question, Betty. Government role is extremely pivotal when we talk about developing the CCUS landscape in any part of the world, whether what we have seen in, for example, North America or Europe or any region that is right now leading the CCUS landscape. The role of the government has been very significant. Now, the role can be varied. It can be either through a very strict policy, it can be through having a very high competitive compliance market that mandates paying of a high carbon price, or it can be a presence of multi-million or billion-dollar funding, tax credit schemes, etc. But all in all, because this technology still doesn't generate revenue, right? And this is always a cost add-on to the production or whatever CCS is a part of. Therefore, in order to be encouraged or for this technology to develop a business case, the role of government is extremely pivotal. And without it, it would be extremely difficult to reach the maturity stage or the large scale stage at which CCS is basically needed. Yeah, that's what I would like to say for this.
Thank you. And the second question is, what are the major hurdles in CCUS implementation in Asia Pacific?
Okay, so the main hurdle, of course, there are many, but the major hurdle that I would say as of today is not having a well-regulated regulation or policy and mandates on how to develop the technology. And that is kind of putting forward a lot of questions on what should be done, how it should be done, how the collaboration should be there, what are the mandates that needs to be followed, for example, laying a pipeline, what are the permits that needs to be taken, etc. So not having a very well regulated policy in the overall region. Of course, we have a lot of policies in Australia. We have the recent CCS regulation coming up in Indonesia. But overall, if we see the region as a whole, it is still something that is quite limited and is something that is needed. Other than that, the learning is still quite new in this place, which means that deployment, we do not have many examples of CCS projects that are operational in the region or have reached the FID. Therefore, the learning curve is still quite steep in terms of technological development in the local region. However, we have a lot of examples that can be taken inspiration from the West, but in terms of locally in the region, it is still quite insignificant. So these are the two aspects that I would that I see are the immediate challenges. And then on top of that, the third main thing that comes is not having enough regulatory support, whether in the form of fundings or tax credit or schemes that I already mentioned in my last answer, is something that is needed, which is something that's still not there to drive the large scale space. So yeah, a combination of regulatory and economic limitation is something that I see. On amalgamating it with technological maturity, which I see as key challenges in the landscape of CCUS in Asia Pacific.
Thank you so much for your answer. Now let's move on to Sohini's next topic, how to inspire collaboration for cross-border CCUS in Asia Pacific. Sohini, now the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Betty. Okay, so now let us look into our third topic, and the last topic from my end on for today's webinar is the collaboration for cross-border CCUS in Asia Pacific. Now, when we talk about collaboration, it can be majorly related to, and it should be majorly related to the cross-border CCS collaborations that is mainly becoming evident. And especially over what we have seen in the last 1 year, a lot of companies across the region are looking into developing cross-border relations. Until now, it was majorly Europe that was leading the space of cross-border initiatives, but now Asia Pacific is also emerging in the space quite massively. Whether it is Japanese or South Korean players forming collaborations with Australian or Southeast Asian players, or for example, Singaporean players forming collaborations with other Southeast Asian players, the momentum has been huge. But in order to drive the space of cross-border CCS collaboration, we really need an amalgamation of rightly balanced economic and policy support. And this is something that would be extremely needed to develop the business case. The first and the foremost is releasing the needed funding and incentives. Yes, as we discussed in the question answering part, or even in my past slides, that it definitely doesn't generate a revenue. And for companies to be encouraged in that, what we have seen in all the other parts of the world where CCS is booming, the role of funding, incentive, or even a tax credit is quite pivotal. And right now, when we talk about APAC, this is still quite limited. Right now, on a global scale, it has approximately 2% of public funding available, but still most of the fundings are more generalized, regional basis. Rather than having very well-focused country basis fundings. Although Australia historically had a few funds, and some of these funds are still now under planned phase, but the amount is still quite limited to drive the space. But if we look into other parts of the world, for example, West European nations or North America or even Middle East, which has announced multi-million-dollar funding, especially over the last 1 year, this definitely is driving the space and is encouraging companies to actually take up the projects in this particular region. And even with cross-border initiatives as well, which also require sufficient amount of investment to develop the entire value chain of network of transportation and storage. This is something that is needed. But right now, in terms of rating, I give it a 1 star because it is still, as we saw, is quite limited and something that would be needed. The second aspect that is likely to be quite important in developing cross-border is establishing business opportunities with CCS as a service. We already know the classic example of Northern Lights, led by the Northern Lights JV, Equinor, etc., that has already been able to secure multiple offtake agreements, and they are developing this wide concept of CCS as a service, and has already been in construction phase with startup soon, looking for, and they're targeting different emitters across European countries with storage in the North Sea of Norway in saline aquifers. So the concept is already established, and having that concept developed which can be a source of revenue because of the tariff generation as a service fee for aiding the storage sites, can be seen as developing a direct, straightforward business opportunity for CCUS space. And this is something that could actually be quite beneficial for driving the space at a point where still funding and the support of the government is, in terms of finances, is still quite limited. And over the last 1 year, the kind of collaborations that has been formed in the CCS space also indicates towards this fact that companies are actually looking to develop the concept of CCS as a service. Now, the third and the most important part, which is definitely needed, even if funding is there, even if the support or companies looking for developing CCS as a service, the most important is having the needed policies and regulation and filling the gaps in the existing policies and regulation to drive the space. We know when we talk about cross-border transportation and storage, one of the most important aspect that comes forward is the London Protocol. So ratification of the London Protocol across all the countries is important and is a mandatory need for facilitating smooth deployment of offshore transportation and storage of carbon dioxide in the waters. Secondly, having quantified standards for safe transportation and storage, determining what are going to be the liability terms, what are the obligations that the emitters or the storage companies needs to fill in case of, say, for example, CO2 leakage or the associated mishaps. What is going to be a storage fee structure that the storage companies can deploy in terms of if they're going for CCS as a service, or whether the CO2 cross-border projects are going to be through bilateral agreements, or they're going to be more about a more broader defined one-to-one project basis. So all these questions and queries are something that are needed to be addressed through the policies, and it is only then that there can be developed significant amount of momentum and trust and optimism in the process that can drive the cross-border CCS collaborations in the overall region, irrespective of where the capture and the storage location lies. So on that note, of course, this is something that is needed. But having said that, we still cannot deny the fact that a lot of companies across the region, what we have seen, have been forming these cross-border collaborations, and that's what we are seeing emerging throughout the region. So to just show you an overview about that, what we have shown here are some of these cross-border alliances where companies are looking for cross-border capture, transportation, and storage. So on the left are mainly the companies that from the capture transportation perspective, where they have more on the emission portfolio. And then the companies are on the right are the organizations which are majorly focused on the storage part of these cross-border alliances. So on the left, if we see, it is very evident that this is a list of companies majorly in Japan and South Korea, from Chiyoda to Mitsui to POSCO to JERA, JBC, JX Nippon, etc., that are forming collaborations with some of the key companies like Pertamina or BP in Indonesia, Petronas in Malaysia, or Santos and Woodside in Australia, focusing on the sequestration or permanent sequestration of carbon dioxide. Therefore, the momentum which we see is already there. The ambitions are there, but what right now is needed to drive the space is filling the gap in policies, as well as developing the proper structure of CCS as a service, followed by releasing the needed amount of fundings or support from the government. So on that note, since we are talking about cross-border alliances and cross-border partnerships, we have shown here a macro potential business model for developing such CCS business schemes in overall region, from the emitter's perspective, as well as the CO2 receiver country, which is the storage perspective. So what we are seeing right now is the need to offset the carbon dioxide through CCS because of no other similar technologies being there that can decarbonize the existing facilities is the reason that is driving the space of CCS, like for example in Japan and South Korea, on top of the different government targets that was announced very recently last year. But having said that, even if they want to deploy the CCS project, one of the major limitation that mainly occurs is whether there is enough amount of space or suitability of sequestration of carbon dioxide that exists in that. And this is the reason that they are looking for the cross-border or potential business collaborations with respect to the technology. And this is where countries, for example, Indonesia, Malaysia, or even Australia are likely to benefit because of the large sequestration capacity that they have, or for example in Australia that also has a very well regulated CO2 storage licensing, or for example what we saw in Indonesia recently with the CCS regulation that they want to address the cross-border transportation and storage of CO2. So, and this in one way can also be a source of revenue generation for the CO2 storage site operators as well, where they can charge CO2 storage fee to the emitters, for example, and therefore can develop the business case for CCUS quite significantly. And another advantage, which when we talk about cross-border transportation and storage that Asia-Pacific countries could have, is having a comparatively lower storage price or storage cost compared to, say, other regions of the world. So this is an analysis of the levelized cost of storage split by different regions. And as we can see, regions like, for example, Southeast Asia, East Asia, South Asia, or even Australia comprises of one of the lowest cost for CO2 storage. And this can be one of the added advantage that can come in handy when we talk about the CO2 storage opportunities in the region compared to the other parts of the world. Okay. So with that, I come to the end of my presentation. Let us discuss if we have any more questions from the floor.
Thank you so much for your insights sharing. Now let's see some questions from our audience. The first question is from the audience who is named Anas Majaduli. Will you speak of the existing carbon capture technologies in APAC today? And how do you think about these technologies and which technology is popular in the APAC CCUS market?
Okay, thank you for the question. So when we speak about technology, I assume we are talking about CO2 capture technology. So please correct me if you want to hear like any other aspect. But in terms of capture technology, it is still the chemical absorption amine that is the most dominant, because this is not only a very mature landscape of CO2 capture technology, which means the learning curve is not very steep, and we have a lot of the technological maturity there. Therefore, it still continues to dominate in Asia Pacific as well. But recently, what we have seen with a lot of emerging new type of CCS projects, especially in offshore, like for example, in an FPSO or maybe the maritime shipping industry, etc., we are seeing growth of more modular and more portable technologies, like for example, membrane, in combination with the existing traditional technologies like chemical absorption that is also emerging in the CCUS landscape of Asia Pacific. But all in all, it still is absorption, chemical absorption that dominates. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your answer. And the second question is, what do you think the top 3 countries is important for the APAC CCUS market?
Can you repeat the question once more? I lost you in between. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. The second question is, what the top 3 countries is important for the APAC CCUS market?
Okay, so this is not going to be a very straightforward answer, because the important thing that comes is on what aspect are are we telling about top three? With respect to cross-border collaborations and having a good storage site development, which is necessary for the other countries, the top three countries, I would say right now in terms of where they are right now in terms of development, it is Australia, Indonesia, and Malaysia. But if we talk about, say, for example, the top three countries in terms of having the highest CCUS projects in the region, China is at the top right now. And then if we talk about, for example, countries in which are looking more from the, going to be quite large in terms of having capture facilities in place, then South Korea and Japan are likely to emerge as well, compared to, for example, Malaysia. Or Indonesia. So it's quite a varied answer, I would say. But all in all, it depends on what you are talking about. In overall CCUS landscape, in terms of importance of the countries, I would say Australia, Southeast Asian countries like Malaysia and Indonesia are likely to be quite pivotal, because not only they are important for their national CCS space, but also catering for the cross-border options, that is helping other countries for developing the CCS projects as a value chain. Yeah. You are mute, Betty. Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much, Sohini. And the last question from our audience is, what would you gonna advise for the APAC CCUS stakeholders in 2024?
Okay, so the main key advice that I would like to, we in Rystad Energy rather would like to give here is that it's extremely important that when you plan a CCUS project, you plan it from all the aspects, which means that it is extremely important that you develop the technological aspect of your project quite importantly, because that is most important in order for you to get the permit on time. If your documentation processes, if your quantification processes of how you are establishing your pipeline route or your storage site is not well established, that could actually lead to delay of getting the permit, or even delay in getting the necessary permissions, the environmental permits, etc. So it is extremely important that from the very initial phase you work towards developing. If you are looking for farm projects with ambitious startup in the next 2 to 3 years. And the second aspect is important that you develop the business case. Try to explore the opportunities which are there where your CCS project is located, whether in terms of whether your project is applicable for a certain carbon credit market, or they are applicable for certain global scale funding or regional scale funding, or they are able to or from, say, if you are a storage company, if you are able to find and shortlist the correct list of off-takers who would sign the off-take agreement with you and therefore pay you the service fee. So strategizing the project more quantifiably is important for in 2024, and it would be extremely crucial for operators to look forward for establishing their project and keeping the timeline of the project intact in the next 2 to 3 years. Yeah.
Thank you for your answer, Sohini. We still got one more question from our audience, Anas Majaduli. Like, how would you estimate the levelized cost of carbon capture in APAC, and is direct air capture technology an important topic in APAC region?
I would say right now, no. Direct air capture is still an outlier. If you talk about the levelized cost of direct air capture, it is on an average, this is 300 to 400 USD per ton, can go up to as high as 900 to 1000 USD per ton. When we talk about traditional CCS, like from point source emissions, etc., it's less than 100 USD per ton. So you can see the difference in cost. And it is still going to remain an outlier in the next 2 to 3 years, because the technology is still immature compared to the others. So we wouldn't say that this is going to be a hot topic in APAC, because APAC is still slowly, gradually emerging in the CCS space. There is still not enough support from the government that can develop the business case. What we are seeing in North America, the reason that is leading the direct air capture space is because of multi-billion-dollar funding that, for example, the Biden government is giving for direct air capture, or the 45Q tax credit, where the compensation for direct air capture is close to 180 USD per ton or so. So it is majorly the support from the government that is driving the direct air capture project from globally. So this is definitely not going to be the scenario here, mainly because of the outlier cost that it lies. And we really do not see direct air capture projects becoming a big thing in Asia Pacific in the next 4 to 5 years. It is still going to be traditional CCS space that is going to lead the space, lead the game.
Thank you so much for your answer, Sohini. I think the audience and we both of us learned much about the CCUS market in the APAC region. And thank you so much for your presentation. And thank you again for your joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And please note that we encourage the active participation during the Q&A sessions following each presentation. And next, it's time to look at our next part, embarking on a new era. The first topic is Australia-Japan value chain in the APAC CCUS market. Joining here is Ms. Celeste Carlovos, Chief Executive Officer, Australia-Japan Business Council of Victoria. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for the really interesting presentation, Sohini. I think there's a lot of synergy between what I'm going to talk about. And I really liked your slide where you showed all the emitters and participants in the CCS value chain and the potential storage players, which I hadn't seen any analysis like that before. So thank you very much. So on the topic of Australia-Japan value chains in the APAC CCUS market, for me, this is a really timely topic. I just got back from Japan in the past 24 hours talking to Japanese parties and government about this topic. And for many of you, you may have noticed the quite, furious pace of MOUs being signed between Australia and Japan these past few months on the topic of CCS value chains, particularly following Australia's ratification of the London Protocol. This level of MOU activity is really significant, given particularly the importance that Japanese companies place on MOUs and the fact that a lot of these are probably several years in the making. So it's really an indication of what we can expect to see in the region in the next few years. So I'm from something called Australia-Japan Business Council of Victoria. We're a 60-year-old business association headquartered in Melbourne, and Melbourne being in Victoria, Australia, where some important Japan, Australia-related hydrogen and CCS work is centered. Is that okay? What? No question? Okay. And our patron of the organisation is Mr. Adam Kaneen, the Victorian Trade and Investment Commissioner to Japan, who I'll refer to later, who's talking on behalf of Victorian Government to the Tomakomai CCS project. So I've been involved in the organisation for around 10 years, and my day job is in decarbonisation and energy transition. I work for a global company where I focus on Australia-Japan energy partnerships in CCS, hydrogen and offshore wind. And my background is that I'm a dual qualified lawyer and civil engineer, and I have a Japan history. So I've lived, worked and studied in Japan and worked at one of Japan's major trading companies. So why are we so interested in Australia-Japan CCS? So the immediate concern on the ground in Australia is that Japan needs to decarbonise its LNG assets or its stakes in LNG assets in Australia in order to comply with the Australian Safeguard Mechanism, which kicked in last year. And from the longer term view, Japan has ambitious CCS deployment targets originating from Japan. and those will require CCS to be injected and stored offshore as well as in Japan. So Japan is working on domestic and transboundary CO2 in parallel. And thirdly, there's a joint opportunity for Australia and Japan to work together to decarbonise the Asia-Pacific and more broadly Indo-Pacific region. Australia is considered by the Global CCS Institute to be an anchor nation. So we have excellent storage resources. We've ratified the London Protocol, and we're recognised by our regional neighbours as a CO2 export destination. Japan is currently classified as an opportunity nation. There's limited known storage potential and limited knowledge of offshore geology, and that's largely due to the fact that the survey data doesn't exist yet in Japan, because Japan doesn't have its own oil and gas industry, so there's limited knowledge of what's going on under the surface, which is being rapidly developed at the moment. So to the point of Japan and Australia and LNG and the safeguard mechanism and CCS, Japan will continue to need a significant amount of fossil fuels in its future energy mix. Oil, coal and gas will continue to comprise 41% of Japan's energy mix in 2030. And the Japanese government has explained that this will need to be coupled with maximum use of CCS. And in terms of how Australia can respond to that need, there's huge CO2 potential in Australia. This map shows Australia's basins ranked for CO2 potential by our Carbon Storage Task Force. And as you can see, there is a lot of highly suitable and possible storage in Australia, shown in the green and yellow colours. And this shows the most recent round of Australian offshore greenhouse gas storage acreage release areas. So those closed for submission at the end of November. And this is further to the 2021 acreage releases, which saw 5 areas awarded greenhouse gas storage assessment permits. So if we turn to Australia policy, what we need to know about is the safeguard mechanism. So the safeguard mechanism is a rule that applies to industrial facilities that emit over 100,000 tonnes per year of CO2 equivalent. And importantly, sorry, there's a typo there, that should say 2023. Facilities need to cut net emissions annually from 1 July 2023. New facilities, including gas fields, have to be net zero from the start of operations. So if you consider the fact that we're still bringing new LNG assets online and they need to be net zero from day one, that's a really significant implication. And in terms of existing assets, Australia supplies 42.7% of Japan's LNG currently. So Japan is going to be significantly affected by this mechanism. And the solution to that is either CCS or purchase of Australian carbon credits or safeguard credits. Because this will have huge financial implication for compliance, a Japanese government has been having very high-level conversations with Australian government about how Japan will be treated under the safeguard mechanism, and has even requested flexibility. And Republic of Korea has also joined Japan in making those requests. At the moment, there are limited funding mechanisms available for safeguard mechanism compliance and CCS. So this just shows that once you exceed the baseline in your emissions, you will need to purchase Australian carbon credit units or safeguard mechanism units. There are some special rules for CCS and ACCUs. So CCS is eligible, CCUS is not eligible, DAC is not eligible. The project needs to be carried out entirely within Australia, which will be interesting to consider once we start establishing cross-border CO2. It's very important that projects comply with tenure laws, including native title, which is related to Australia's First Nations people, which is very much the key part of stakeholder engagement process for any project in Australia. participants need to consider long-term reversal risks, and projects must be new to qualify. So this map is reproduced from GCCSI and shows current commercial and pilot demonstration projects in Australia, plus any publicly announced Japanese participation. In the case of the CO2 CRC Otway project, the Japanese involvement is through technology, through the Japan Research Institute of Innovative Technology for the Earth, RITE. And according to a presentation by RITE at a CCS workshop in Japan yesterday, this planning stage is now in stage 4. We've also just heard in relation to the Santos Moomba CCS project, which is in the middle of the map in South Australia, that has now secured finance of US $150 million over a 5-year period to cover project costs. So that's a big development for that project, and that will anticipated to cover 80% of the project costs. Turning now to Japan policy. So the Japanese government's long-term roadmap study group final summary sets out a ramp up of annual CCS capacity to 12 million metric tonne by 2030 and 240 million metric tonne by 2050. Interestingly, and quite unusually for Japan, we're seeing aggressive corporate targets for CCS as well from companies such as JX Nippon. And in terms of where we're going in Japan, there was a really important development a couple of weeks ago, which was the first passage of the bill on carbon dioxide storage business in Japan. So that's basically the legislation to set up a domestic CCS regime in Japan. It was passed in the lower house in February and is now in the upper house for approval. There's a long list of bills in there for approval, but this CCS bill, along with the concurrently released hydrogen bill, are set to be high priority bills for the Diet and will be treated early, potentially within the next couple of months. And the purpose of the bill is to, while maintaining public safety and preserving the marine environment, create a business environment for private operators to start CCS projects in Japan by 2030 via the establishment of a permit system for exploratory drilling of 4 years. And you can see that diagram on the bottom right that shows the allocation of responsibility between the parties. And my apologies, these aren't yet translated into English, but we see that METI, who will be joining us later in this session, and JOGMEC will each have a function. METI will designate specified areas of suitable storage and approve implementation plans, and JOGMEC will take over management tasks once stored CO2 has been stabilised, and there will be a no-fault liability regime for operators. In terms of a second key step for Japan and CCS, the Japanese roadmap references promising overseas storage potential and current negotiations for CO2 export. At the moment, the Japanese government has not determined how much CO2 will be injected and stored domestically versus overseas, and it has stated that all options will be pursued. We also have a lot of leadership shown by Japan in regional activities such as the Asia CCUS network and the joint crediting mechanism, which are a key part of Japan's external facing strategy. So in terms of progress on the engagement side, there's a number of collaborations between Australia and Japan, both bilaterally and multilaterally. We have the Australia-Japan Partnership on Decarbonisation through Technology. We have an MOU between Japan CCS and the Victorian Government. We have an RITE CSIRO collaboration on fault detection, characterisation and hazard assessment, and various others. And we now have more active engagement in London Protocol correspondence, with Australia having ratified the London Protocol on 13th of November 2023, which now leads the way for agreements or arrangements between contracting parties like Australia and other parties contracting or non-contracting like Japan. Okay. On the bilateral side, this photo was taken in Melbourne, where I live, in October 2023 at the 5th Australia-Japan Ministerial Economic Dialogue. And we have Minister Nishimura and our trade resources and climate change and economic ministers discussing energy security against the backdrop of the safeguard mechanism. And I think it's really important for us to remember that when it comes to Japan, energy supply and security is really the first priority, being so heavily dependent on importing energy, and sustainability and emissions, it really comes after that, which is potentially a different situation to a country like Australia. Here we have a photo in September 2023 in Hiroshima at the 3rd Asia CCUS Network Forum, where an MOU was signed between Japan CCS, which is implementing the Tomakomai CCS project, and Victorian government, which is implementing the Carbon Net project, to cooperate in sharing CCS deployment experience. And if we look from the multilateral perspective, Japan has shown really significant regional leadership in establishing the Asia CCUS network. And this is part of the AETI, International Industry Academia Government Platform. And we can see that Japan has kindly also brought Australia into these discussions. So in terms of progress on actual projects, so first type is Japan government-supported projects. In June, JOGMEC selected 7 candidate projects for feasibility studies, and they target a wide range of industries such as electric power, oil refinery, steel, chemicals, cement, and pulp paper. And they will capture CO2 from industrial clusters in Hokkaido, Kanto, Chubu, Kinki, Setouchi, and Kyushu regions, and aim to store approximately 13 MTPA of CO2. 5 of those are purely domestic, and 2 will export CO2 to Asia and Oceania. And the one exporting to Oceania has a storage amount of approximately 2 million tonnes per year targeted, and that's between Mitsubishi, Nippon Steel, and ExxonMobil. And we understand that proposals are also being put forward by industry to JOGMEC for second round potential advanced CCS projects for future funding. There are some rare examples of projects that have multi-government support. So one is here in Victoria called the HESC project, the Hydrogen Engineering Supply Chain Project, which has an accompanying CCS project. That project is the world first to supply liquid hydrogen from Victoria to Japan, which has already been successful in a pilot phase. And that involves the Japanese and Australian participants, Kawasaki Heavy Industries, J-Power, Iwatani, Marubeni, AGL, Sumitomo. And interestingly, it's supported by state and federal Australian government and Japanese government. And this requires an accompanying CCS project to sit alongside it. So in terms of why this project is suitable for CCS, hydrogen will be produced from fossil fuels in close proximity to the suitable location for CCS sequestration, and CO2 generated from the hydrogen can be sequestered through low cost, through minimized transport distance, and clean hydrogen produced in mass quantities can be transported to customers. So the project takes advantage of Victoria's significant brown coal resources and suitable geological formations for CCS. We also have seen a number of private sector-led initiatives for transboundary CO2 between Australia and Japan. So just in the past few months, we've seen a number of announcements between Australia and Japan, including also in Indonesia and Malaysia, between a number of players that were also referred to in the previous presentation. So in terms of interesting case studies, the Northern Territory government has formalised net zero by 2050, and we know that CCS has a role in hydrogen production. There's a joint initiative between Northern Territory government, CSIRO, INPEX, Santos, Woodside, Eni, Origin Energy, and Exodus to investigate a low emission CCUS hub. And that project has explored methanol, jet fuel, methane, urea, and mineral carbonates. And there was also an excellent presentation from CSIRO on this yesterday at Japan's CCS Technical Forum. And going through the business case for this project, it's very interesting from a macroeconomics and emissions and best practice point of view, the fact that it can be internationalized, and a number of other factors coming together, which are a sort of best case scenario, but also show us how these projects are becoming increasingly complex. So in terms of opportunities for Japan, we looked at hydrogen fuels and CCS for this, various industrial products and new industries. And one thing to note that's interesting about these kinds of hubs is that we don't yet have an Australian carbon credit unit accounting system for hubs, so it will be interesting to see how that transpires. I think we're ahead of schedule, so I might take a couple more minutes, Betty. One of the projects benefiting from the ratification of the London Protocol is the Bayu-Undan CCS project. Japan has a net 20.6% interest in this, with INPEX, JERA and Tokyo Gas, and Japanese customers including TEPCO and Tokyo Gas. So this is a situation where we may see Japanese CO2 eventually transported to Timor-Leste and injected and stored there. But the immediate application is in relation to a gas field in Australia that Japan is also involved in, called Barossa. So in terms of, and this is the final section, challenges and next steps. So the International Energy Agency identifies 4 key areas as being challenges on CCS, CCUS projects: economic viability, lead times, innovation gaps, and project complexity. On the economic side, projects need more government funding. We need a carbon price. More work needs to be done on leakage policy, contracts for difference, and funding instruments. If we're looking at Australia, Japan partnering in the region, funding instruments for emerging markets. Lead times are still too high at the moment, around 6 years from conception to commissioning, and recent Japanese investor uncertainty and nervousness about Australia has only compounded this. This has largely been in relation to gas. So there have been some movements in gas-related policy in Australia that probably didn't have the same level of consultation that we would see in Japan, and that had significant impacts, which has led to some Japanese investor uncertainty and unusually Japanese CEOs speaking up and Japanese government speaking up against recent policy developments. We do need a simplification of Australian permitting requirements, including community engagement and clear approval timelines. We are seeing significant legal challenges in Australia to projects, whereby all parties would benefit from clearer consensus building requirements, and we would all benefit from more data sharing and transparency. Further R&D needs to be done through co-development and international platforms, and at the moment it's potentially the case that the more advanced technologies don't necessarily correlate to the best net zero cases. So there is, as always with the energy transition, levelling to be done there. And finally, projects are becoming increasingly cross-border and complex. So we do need bilateral agreements or arrangements under the London Protocol, coordinated international frameworks. And again, that's something that Japan has taken the lead in, with METI making proposals to ASEC, long-term liability legislation. We really need first mover advantages so that the people taking the initial risks benefit from that, and a number of other specifications. And these are all just very briefly reflected in Japan's CCS roadmap. So Japan sees the need for all of this, for government support, for efforts to reduce CCS costs, for improving public understanding of CCS projects. Public understanding is an issue in Australia as well, even though we've had the CO2 CRC Research Centre successfully proving CCS technology for a very long time. Promotion of overseas CCS business, collaboration towards a CCS business law, and formulation of future action plans. So if you are in the Australia-Japan space, encourage you to get in touch with the Australia-Japan Business Council of Victoria. My contact details are on here. So I'll turn to you now, Betty, for any questions.
Thank you for your enlightening speech, Celeste. And here I've got some questions for you. And the first question is, what economic benefits are expected for both Australia and Japan through the establishment of the CCUS value chain?
Thanks, Betty. There's a few benefits. So a clear one is the ability to produce hydrogen at commercial scale. So that's something that CCS will allow, for example, through being coupled with blue hydrogen, or more broadly in a hub arrangement. We can create new low carbon industries through hydrogen and CCS hubs, such as the Northern Territory Low Emissions Hub that I mentioned earlier. There's potential for infrastructure reuse. So, for example, repurposing gas pipelines for CO2, and that can also be done for hydrogen. Theoretically, CCS should be a better way to comply with the safeguard mechanism than purchasing Australian carbon credit units, but that's still uncertain. And job creation, of course, and overall, at a broader level, I think once CCS is more established in Australia, including Japanese participation, there'll be a broader benefit to creating investor confidence in Australian projects from Japan and other investors.
Thank you for your answer. And the second question is, how will the project contribute to the job creation and local economic development in both countries?
One thing that I've read recently about CCS, which is interesting, is that CCS is unusual in that it can create energy transition jobs in the actual location of hard-to-abate sectors, because if the CCS is sitting near the emissions location, it means that the same people working in the emissions intensive industries could potentially work in the CCS new industry located nearby, for example, steel or cement or fertilizer. So one of the challenges of energy transition is that the projects aren't always in the right locations to compensate for a project site that's shutting down. So, for example, you might be shutting down a coal mine, but the local state's solar or wind farm maybe nowhere near there, and that doesn't create a replacement job for the people that are no longer working in the fossil fuel industry. So that's one interesting point.
Thank you so much for your answer, Celeste. And thank you again for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And next, we will look at the role of Japan in advancing CCUS development. Let's welcome Japanese Government Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry. Let's welcome the Ms. Yumiko Hata. Yumiko, the stage is now yours.
Thank you. Thank you for your introduction. And my name is Yumiko Hata at Carbon Management Division of METI. And Carbon Management Division was newly established, launched in last summer, combining the CCU and CCS to promote the carbon management as a portfolio, one of the portfolio to achieve the carbon neutrality in 2050. And let me share the my slides. Okay, so maybe Can you see that? Okay. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. And today I would like to share Japan's effort for CCUS carbon recycling policy, in other name, the carbon management policy. And you can see that diagram in a circular manner, and we illustrate the circular use of CO2 and safe storage through the CCS. So you can start the diagram from left bottom, from the capture from the carbon dioxide from atmosphere or industrial emission through the carbon capture technology or DAC technology. And you can store safely the carbon dioxide in the ground utilizing the CCS technology. And we have rough estimation of the 120 to 240 million tons per annum around 2050. Also, we can utilize the carbon dioxide in a circular manner to produce various products such as e-fuels, e-methanes, and SAF, as well as chemical products or concretes that fix the carbon dioxide. And we also see the potential of CO2 utilization around 2050. So we would like to promote both CCS and CCU towards 2050. From the next slide, I will firstly touch upon the CCS policy and then briefly for the CCU carbon recycling policy, because those two policies are combining or very much compatible to promote the carbon neutrality for 2050. For CCS, Japan published the Japan's long-term roadmap on CCS in last March. And as I touch upon a little, we have rough estimation of annual storage capacity of 120 to 240 million tons per annum by 2050. And to realize that, we have target to start the CCS business by 2030 with an aim of enabling carbon dioxide storage of about 6 million to 12 million tons per annum. That is around 1% of the total current emission of Japan, but I think it is a good start for CCS around 2030. So securing around 1% of our current emission of CO2. And to start with, as in Celeste's last presentation, we started to support advanced CCS project from the last year. From this fiscal year. We have selected 7 projects. 5 is domestic and 2 is overseas projects. And to create business models, we have various consortiums with various CO2 sources from the thermal power plant, steel plant, chemical plant, or cement plant, and several transport methods, pipeline and shipping, and as well as vehicles, and various CO2 storage area onshore or near shore or offshore. And this is the map and 7 projects diagram. And currently 7 consortiums are undergoing the feasibility study for the CCS projects and expected to further move to the phase of exploration or test drilling and making investment decision. And to start with the CCS business from 2030, we expect that the company need to make an investment decision by fiscal 2026. So time is short, And we need to make a sound business environment, both in legislative manner, as well as how to support in of the CCS value chain and CCS business for sound development of that business. Firstly, in the legislation area, we submitted the bill for the CCS business in this diet session. So actually, the cabinet submitted the bill in the last month. In this bill, we set out several measures to define rights and obligations of the storage operators. So as you can see in the number 1, we set the storage right for the storage operator that can be protected by the other parties' exploration or the other business activities. At the same time, we cast several regulations or obligations to storage operators, such as to make the implementation plans for before starting the injection projects. We also cast the obligation of monitoring during the operation, as well as after the cease of CO2 injection. We also prohibit the storage operators from refusing storage requests from other CO2 emitters, because the pipelines or storage will be limited for the time being, and we see that storage and pipelines have more public characteristics. Also, storage operators must comply with safety regulations according to the CCS business law. Next, we also set some obligations after the cease of CO2 injections. We are planning to transfer the management of storage site to JOGMEC. After stable CO2 behavior will be shown by the government. Learning from the other countries' regulation, we will hopefully pass the bill during this diet session, and after that, we will firstly create the several regulations for actually implement this law as soon as possible. In addition, we have several regulations on the pipeline also, but we have not decided to cast some regulations for carbon capture operator, because carbon capture operator is just starting, and we have not have enough knowledge to make a regulation for carbon captures. But we are very carefully follow and see the state of the carbon capture businesses, and will make a proper amendment in the future if we need some regulation in that area too. In addition to the regulatory measures, we also aiming to ratify the London Protocol through these diet sessions to enable the overseas transport of carbon dioxide. To enable the overseas CCS business, we also established the Asian CCUS Network Forum from 2021 and discussed our aim for overseas CCS business, as well as the issues and challenges we commonly have. And for example, the joint crediting systems and rules for transporting CO2 to the other countries. In the last year, in the last September, we had third Asia CCUS Network Forum at Hiroshima. and together with the Carbon Recycling International Forum Conference. And the conference published the joint statement stating the outcome of the conference. In that statement, we highlighted the usefulness of the JOGMEX, Japan Organization for Metals and Energy Securities, CCS and CO2 EOR guidelines handbook for countries, Asian countries who are seeking to expand CO2 EOR or CCS projects for their own energy security and transition. As in the picture, you can Google handbook for CCS carbon credits, and you can download the full report from the JOGMEC website for the reference. At the Asia CCS Network Forum, we also had the MOC on the cross-border of CO2 transportation signed by METI, JOGMEC, and Petronas to promote discussions on transboundary CO2 movement and storage. We will further deepen the discussion on transboundary transport of CO2, inviting various stakeholders throughout the Asia and the rest of the world to promote the CCS business by 2030. In addition to promote those businesses, to gain understanding from the public is also very much important. Actually, we have the project at Tomakomai, the northern land of Hokkaido, and we successfully injected 30,000 tons of CO2 from 2016 and 2019. Actually, its project is very unique because the injection site is very close to the people's living area. So in the very early stage of the projects, the several stakeholders actually stated their concerns about the safety of the demonstration project, but having accumulated the data and information disclosure, people slowly understand the importance of CCS for the carbon neutrality and its safety. We have ended the CO2 injection at this CCS project site area, but we have continuing our monitoring effort, and we will further deepen our understanding for the safe storage of the CCS. For example, the last September, MOU on technical collaboration has been concluded between Japan CCS company and Victorian government. Also, we also conducting the safety projects together with the US and Australian government and institutions. In this Australian site, fiber optic monitoring method was demonstrated very close to the fault. Throughout this demonstration project, we will further gather and accumulate the necessary data for ensuring the safety of the CCS project. Lastly, let me touch upon Japan's contribution towards CCS value chain. I have illustrated many companies' logos in this area, from CO2 capturing technology to transport and pipeline material and further storage total engineering. Japan has several companies who can contribute in this area. So we will further deepen our business models, not only in our domestic areas, but also in our international area too. My next content is CCU and carbon recycling policy, I believe, which is closely related to the CCS policy in the name of the carbon management. You can see that actually many Japanese companies are eager to going out from our country to the other countries such as the United States, to Asian countries, including Australia and Oceania countries, and also European countries to further promote the e-fuels or e-methanes or concretes in the other generation projects. We believe, as in this diagram, if we can see the whole process of CCU, circular use of CO2 can contribute to CO2 emission suppression because we can produce and use product without deriving new fossil fuels. In other words, we can make the other economic activities or other energy activities without additional carbon production into the atmosphere or additional carbon introduction to the environment. So, but to promote the carbon recycling or CCU, the cost and energy consumption is key. To realize that, we created a roadmap in last year and illustrated several targets for several carbon recycling products. And to enable that, we will promote research and development activities for further lowering costs and energy consumption. For example, utilizing the Green Innovation Fund projects, we have a fiscal 2020 budget of US dollars 3.8 billion. We have been promoting several projects in 5 areas, starting with concrete and cement, such as developing technologies for maximizing the volume of CO2 absorbed in a cement or concrete products, or recycled carbon fuel with low cost or low energy consumption in the areas of synthetic fuels, synthetic methane, and further LPGs, or chemicals or biomanufacturing, as well as CO2 capture technologies from various CO2 sources, including ambient atmospheres or very low pressure and low concentration carbon sources, such as gas power plant. We also opened the R&D and demonstration base at Osaki Kamishima, Hiroshima, and where we produce the captured CO2 to the researchers for the research and development use, and several projects are undergoing at this area. We will further promote the creation of the CO2 value chain for the sake of both CCS and CCU, and further in the future for the DAC and CDR technologies. And this is my end of my presentations, and thank you for listening.
Thank you for the insights sharing, Ms. Yumiko. Thank you again. And now let's see some questions from our audience. The first question is, how does Japan engage in APAC collaboration on CCUS?
Thank you. So, as I stated, we have been organizing the Asia CCUS Network Forum from 2021, inviting several countries' governments as well as stakeholders such as companies and institutions. And in that forum, we have been successfully exchanging our views and sharing our challenges for making the sound development of the CCS and making the rules in this area. We are open to the rest of the world and to further develop the rules and necessary measures for transboundary CCS projects.
Thank you for your detailed answer, Yumiko, and thank you again for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
And next, it's time to delve into ever cross-border open source infrastructure network for CO2 transport and storage project. Here, I extend a warm welcome to Mr. Badas Dulik, CO2 shipping and commercial manager of Northern Lights. And Badas, the stage is now yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So I'm going to talk about Northern Lights project. I'm calling from Norway. So Northern Lights is a joint venture of Equinor, Shell, and Total Energies. Basically, we are providing a transportation and storage service for CO2. The idea started back in 2016 when Norwegian state played a key role bringing the key players and trying to establish this end-to-end value chain of industrial carbon capture, transportation, and storage. If you look at the timeline, we expect to be operational or ready for operations by the end of this year. So from 2016, the idea, and 2024, ready for operations, the key message is that these type of industrial projects do take time. It's been 8 years for us. If you look at the core projects, it started with 2 industrial sites and us as Northern Lights. Our first 2 founding customers are also in Norway. One of them is, as shown on the map, the Celsio company, which is a waste incineration for power generation plants. They produce about 40% of Oslo city emissions. The second customer is Heidelberg Cement Facility in Brevik, also in Norway, and they're also supported by the Norwegian state. So with these 2 first customers and us Northern Lights providing transportation and storage services, we started the project development. It's always good to put things on a schematic. So I will go through this basic schematic with you to show our services and how this value chain works simply. So on the left-hand side, you see the industrial customers. We expect the customers to capture their CO2 with their suppliers, of course, liquefy, purify the CO2, and make the CO2 available for ship loading at their shore terminal. Then the solid line is our scope of services. We come with our ships, we load the liquefied CO2 cargo on our ships, so the risk transfers to us at the manifold from the shore terminal to the ship. Then our ships sail to Norway, to our intermediate receiving terminal. Here we unload the cargo in the vertical storage tanks that you see. We store the CO2 for a brief moment of time where we increase the pressure and we pump it offshore for injection into the wells for about 3 kilometers underground for permanent storage. So I would like to talk about our successful last year, and this is a summary slide. Each of these points I will touch on in the coming slides in a bit more detail. So this is just a summary. So last year, in addition to our first 2 customers, we signed world's first 2 commercial agreements, one with Yara and one with Rystad. So these are first of their kind in the sense that they are international. Yara is in the Netherlands, and Rystad is in Denmark, and we will be transporting and storing CO2 from these industrial customers. I will talk about these shortly. Then a second point is that our facilities reached 91% completion rate overall. The 2 wells that we previously drilled, we tested them, they look good, so they are ready for injection of CO2, and we will be ready for operations on schedule and on cost by the end of this year. On a different point, in addition to the first 2 CO2 ships that we ordered back in 2021, last year we ordered another 2 ships. So with the 4 CO2 ships on order now, we are building the world's largest dedicated CO2 shipping fleet. And finally, in December last year, we got some good news that EU awarded us 131 million euros for our expansion of phase 2 facilities. So let's talk about commercial customer contracts first. In one of the earlier slides, I mentioned that we had 2 founding customers in Norway. One was a waste incineration plant, the other one was a cement factory, two different industries. In addition to those 2 customers, last year we signed 2 commercial agreements. One with Yara in Netherlands, an ammonia and fertilizer plant, and the other one is with Rystad in Denmark, a bioenergy plant. So each of these customers will provide 800,000 tons and 430,000 tons of CO2 to us, respectively. Again, these 2 are in their own right first-of-a-kind agreements with shipping, cross-country transportation of CO2 and storage. If you look at our facilities progress, so this is an aerial image of our facility, receiving facility at Oygarden, where we will receive the CO2 ships. At the jetty that you see, the ships will unload the CO2. The CO2 will go to the vertical tanks that you see, 12 of them. And then from there, it will be injected through a tunnel pipeline, 100 kilometers offshore into the wells and subsurface. On the left-hand side, you have this brown to black building. It's our admin and visitor center. Last year, we had more than 6,000 visitors at our facility. And on the right-hand side, you can see that we have flattened the area and we are ready for expansion of our phase 2 facilities. We already pre-ordered some more vertical storage tanks, 9 more, to expand into phase 2 facilities. If you talk about our construction activities, this is a photo from our pipeline campaign. So we have this 100-kilometer pipeline from our intermediate receiving facility to offshore wells. And this photo is from March 2023, a year ago when we started the pipeline campaign. From a pipeline perspective, we are about 70% complete, and we will start the second and final phase of the campaign in the coming weeks to complete the remaining parts so that we are ready for operations by the end of this year. About our CO2 ships, this is of course, computer graph. I'm going to show you some real photos of the ships as well. We now have 4 ships on order. We are building the world's largest dedicated CO2 shipping fleet. These 4 ships are sister ships. Each of them have 7,500 cubic meter capacity and a length of 130 meters. So when it comes to this end-to-end value chain, including the terminals, loading terminals, ships and receiving terminals, it's important that they are compatible, and it's important to select a pressure and temperature regime that works across the value chain, optimizes the cost as well. So we selected here in Northwest Europe, of course, the medium pressure range. Medium pressure meaning something around 15 bar and minus 26 degrees Celsius. Of course, for each value chain, the right temperature and pressure level may be different. For example, for Asia, distances are longer and ship sizes may have to be larger. And for example, low pressure, such as 7-8 bar, may be the right level of pressure for the Asian trade. But when we look at Northwest Europe, the sailing distances are much shorter. You typically see 1 to 3 days of sailing distances only. And this type of range and pressure seems to be optimal for our trade here in Northwest Europe. In terms of ship construction progress, it's going well. The first 2 ships are at the dry dock, as you can see. In the coming weeks, the dry dock will be slowly flooded and the ships will be sailed out for outfitting at the berth. And the keel will be laid for the following 2 ships that we ordered at the same shipyard. These are some of the photos from the cargo tank installation at the shipyard. So this is about a month-old photos. So each of the ships have 2 of these large cargo tanks. The cargo tanks are 3,750 cubic meters in size. And 2 of them, of course, make the ship 7,500 cubic meters. So 4 of these cargo tanks came for the first 2 ships, and they have been installed successfully about a month ago in the shipyard. So what's next for Northern Lights, and what are the stages of our progress? So we have now phase 1 under construction. It's going to have 1.5 million tons per annum capacity, and we are fully sold out, and we will be ready for operations by the end of this year. We ordered 4 ships, 7,500 cubic meters, and 2 of them will be delivered in the second half of this year as well. We drilled 2 wells. One is the main well, one of them is the backup, and we tested them. We are ready for injection. We already pre-invested for phase 2, some civil works you have seen on the photos, and we have an oversized pipeline ready for phase 2 operations, and we already pre-ordered some storage tanks as well, onshore storage tanks. So basically phase 1 is fully sold out. It's a combination of Norwegian state-supported customers and commercial customers. We have 4 different industrial sectors: waste incineration, ammonia, biofuels, and cement manufacturing. 4 different customers represented. When it comes to phase 2 expansion, you can see on the schematic, it's the square box on the right-hand side. Phase 2 will involve filling the pipeline, the oversized pipeline. So we will expand our capacity, subject to investment decision, of course, from the 1.5 million tons to about 5 to 7 million tons, as much as we can put through the pipeline. So this will involve ordering of more ships, installing of more onshore storage tanks, increasing the pump capacity, and more wells, and a second jetty that you also see in the diagram on the right-hand side. And finally, of course, Northern Lights has ambitions to be much more than 5 to 7 million tons. So we are looking for additional pore space in Norwegian offshore continental shelf, and we are looking at various concepts for phase 3 as well. So this brings an end to my presentation. Thanks, Betty.
Thank you so much for this illuminating speech. And here are some questions for you, Mr. Brothers. The first question is, as we know, the cost of the CCUS project is very expensive. And how did Northern Lights carry out and complete this project? And what can APAC learn from it?
Thank you. Indeed, as you can see, the CCS projects involve a lot of CapEx, upfront investment. So we look at, on the customer side, capture of the CO2, liquefaction, purification process. And if they involve shipping, of course, they have to build a shore terminal. Or even if they have an existing shore terminal, they may need onshore storage tanks and loading arms. And when it comes to our scope, we have ships involved, receiving terminal, pipelines possibly, and wells. Indeed, it is a capital-intensive project. Of course, for this, in Europe, we have, if I could put it that way, a carrot and stick approach from the EU and the governments. So the stick is the cost of CO2. EU ETS emission trading system puts a cost to CO2 emissions. This was up to €100 per ton until last year, and then recently, unfortunately, it fell a bit to €60 per ton. Nevertheless, it gives an incentive for companies to avoid emitting of CO2. In addition, of course, there are certain additional support schemes in the EU, so government subsidies and supports also help. So at the moment, it depends on this carrot and stick approach. Betty.
Thank you, Mr. Brothers. And there is another question from our audience, Hao Xing. We understood that Northern Lights capacity has been booked out in phase 1. How are the capacity booking system work?
Thank you. As with any large-scale project, one of the key challenges is to align all the important pieces of the project at the same time. So, for example, for us, as with phase 1, phase 2, or any future phases will involve both signing up customers enough to give us a foresight of revenue, but at the same time, maturing the cost base of our investment, so that the investment is viable and we will be able to recuperate the investment we made. So for us, we really try to mature these at the same time, working with our suppliers, maturing our investment cost base, and simultaneously negotiating with our customers that give us enough capacity, enough booking in the basically firm booking book, that we can take an investment decision simultaneously. So for us, the expansion from 1.5 to 5 million tons is an additional 3.5 million tons per annum. We don't intend to sign up the entire capacity all at once, but we need a significant chunk of bookings all at the same time, mature with our suppliers so that we take the next stage. Thanks, Betty.
Thank you so much for your answer, Mr. Bartos. And thanks again for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now it's time to dive into our final topic for today's session, unleashing carbon capture development, UK experience shared. Let's welcome Mr. John Waldron, Head of Policy Development Team, Power CCUS, from UK Government, Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. And Mr. John, the stage is now yours.
Hi there, thanks very much for having me. I'm delighted to be with you all and presenting this topic today at 6 a.m. sitting here in my suit in the UK. So an early start for me, but I'm very excited to tell you a bit more about UK carbon capture and storage. Let me just check how best I can share my slides with you. It is not normally that we use Zoom, so apologies for that. How is that something everyone can see? If that's coming across.
Yes, we can see your slides.
Brilliant. So I'll fire away straight away. So just what I'm going to talk through is a brief overview of CCUS policy in the UK, both right now, but also some lessons learned from our past experience. I'll start with why are we doing this? What is the needs case for CCUS? In the UK, the clear driving force is decarbonisation, and the CCUS policies are all designed to help us reach our net zero by 2050 ambition. And the UK's independent advisor on climate change, the Committee on Climate Change, has said CCUS is a necessity, not an option. That's something we very much agree with here in the UK government as well. And what I'm showing is just a pathway to the mid-2030s to meet our carbon budgets, which set out the steps we need to take on the way to net zero. And you can see decarbonisation is required in all sectors, but also a slowly growing blue wedge down at the bottom, which is greenhouse gas removals, so negative emissions. And CCUS really has a key role to play in two aspects here. It touches all of the hard to abate sectors across the whole economy, and we need CCUS to decarbonise difficult sectors within industry, but also potentially to facilitate transportation decarbonisation through things like sustainable aviation fuels, and to do the hard yards in sectors where we're already decarbonising well, sectors like the power sector. And also we need CCUS to provide the bulk of our greenhouse gas removal, so the negative emissions, the net part of net zero. So that's why do we need CCUS? I think that's really important to start with the purpose. In terms of what that means for our policies and how we've set out our ambitions to drive CCUS deployment, we've talked already about our net zero target, and we've translated that into a CO2 storage ambition to store 20 to 30 million tons of CO2 by 2030. And it has huge benefits for the UK economy. Up to 50,000 jobs can be supported by 2030. And it's really important for a just transition for sectors like the oil and gas sector to ensure people have a route to long-term sustainable jobs in all regions of the UK. And then we've also gone down one layer further and set out a series of sectoral ambitions and statements of what we're trying to do within each sector. So the power sector where I work, we've said we're going to deploy at least one power generation plant with CCUS in the 2020s. and multiple additional projects by 2030. We've also got ambitions and targets for hydrogen production, CCUS-enabled blue hydrogen production, industrial carbon capture, and of the engineered greenhouse gas removals, which is what I talked about on the previous slide. Before I go into our lessons learned, I thought I'd just give you a snapshot of why the UK is uniquely well placed for CCUS success and why it's a great place to invest. So, we've got a brilliant investment environment. I won't go through all the stats on the slide for you there. It's a slide sort of commonly used by our international trade colleagues, etc., showing why the UK is a great place for international businesses to invest their capital. But in terms of the CCUS specific aspects, we've also got a great storage ecosystem and storage resource, very similar to our Norwegian counterparts. So there's 78 gigatons of potential CO2 storage capacity in the UK. And a lot of this is in areas with well-developed oil and gas infrastructure that can either be reused or repurposed, or at least gives us the geological information and insights to understand those rock formations very well. And the UK's got a really world-class service sector to support businesses, but also a huge engineering capability, including offshore engineering capability from both the oil and gas sectors, but also the offshore wind sector. So I'll go on to the topic of what have we learned and how have we come to where we've got to today. So the current UK approach is called the cluster sequencing approach. I'll talk about that in a bit more detail, but I'll give you the potted history first. So the first UK CCUS competition was actually launched back in 2007, and negotiations were started with private sector projects. And one of the learnings from that first competition, relatively long time ago now, in the infancy of CCUS as an industry, is that the private sector might not be able to bear the whole of the cross-chain risk. The way the model was set up was that the private sector needed to sort out the interactions across the CCUS chain between the capture projects and the stores themselves. And government was negotiating with all parties on a sort of full outcome and a full chain project at a particular price. And the negotiations, as I understand it, was not involved then. They broke down based on the private sector parties' unwillingness to kind of bear those cross-chain risks and bring the project together themselves. So then we had the second UK competition, which was in 2012. And here, the model was slightly evolved and there was more funding behind it from the UK government point of view. But it was still a single project full chain model with carbon capture applied at a single location at a large project connecting to a single store. And as that process developed, it became clear that the value for money from a government point of view was under strain, and the whole full chain model can increase the costs to government. So government had addressed some of the issues around private sector bearing too much risk, but hadn't addressed issues around these cross-chain risks and this full chain model of a single project connecting to a single store. And that resulted in the value for money not looking attractive to government this time, and government ultimately decided not to go ahead with that competition in 2015. And so then there was a bit of a restart in 2017, 2018. And the key learning from that was, I think, the previous two competitions, government had largely gone away, developed a model, and then tested it through negotiations. In 2018, we took a different approach and co-collaborated and co-developed with the industry. So I think collaboration is really key to getting the policy right, understanding, the sector and the makeup of the sector in your country, but also what investors want in your country. If you're going down the route of trying to attract private sector investment, it's really important to understand, what the other side is looking for. And so there was a CCUS council set up, chaired by the minister, which still exists today. and there was a cost reduction task force and a CCUS action plan published ultimately. And this was all in collaboration with industry kind of heavily involved in developing the model. And the key things that came out of that were that we wanted to break down the model. So instead of having a single full chain model that covered all of the costs, we've set up multiple support mechanisms or business models that cover each of the individual elements of the chain. So all of the different capture sectors have their own different model, which is supported by government or consumer investment, and the store is a separate regulated model that with money flowing through from the capture projects. So that's one of the key learnings, is a more sophisticated model to deal with those cross-chain risks, but also ensure each aspect of the CCUS chain is treated separately, because there's bespoke reasons why you're supporting each individual sector, and different incentives are required for different sectors. A one-size-fits-all model, it's been something that, you know, the sector and ourselves have decided is not right for the UK landscape. And then beyond that, we kind of really leaned into net zero. You know, net zero was first signed into UK law in 2019. And then we published the net zero strategy and the 10-point plan in 2020 and 2021. And that really cemented the rationale for CCUS. We've now got a very clear purpose and clear ambitions for doing CCUS in the UK. I think that's important to ensure that the political commitment's there and the commitment from government, but also that you've got a clear direction of where you're traveling to and how much of the different technologies you want to deploy. And then the final thing I'm going to touch on this slide is, by 2021, we then launched the cluster sequencing program. That's what we call it. And the reason why we've gone for this cluster approach is based on feedback from industry, again, also our own research and understanding, is that the clustering together of multiple projects can maximize the benefits, but also brings economies of scale. So connecting more than one capture project into the same store really increases the value for money and increases the amount of CO2 that can be stored for the same amount of costs, because you're reusing or fully utilizing that infrastructure. And so the map on the right is where we are today, which we've got two elements of the cluster sequencing process already beginning. So we've got the track one of the cluster sequencing process, which was the first two clusters to be announced, which is in the northwest of England. It's called HyNet cluster, and in the northeast on the east coast called the East Coast cluster, not so innovatively named. And we've got the track two clusters, which are just beginning. One up in Scotland called Acorn, and one on the Humber region, which is again on the east coast, further south. And the industrial emissions and other sources of emissions from the Humber area are so large that it's likely to ultimately be connected both up to the East Coast cluster and across to the Viking cluster and the Viking store. So kind of really connecting that network of emissions with the network of stores. But I'll move on, and the next slide has got a lot to it, but we don't have a lot of time today, so I'll keep it brief. But this is basically how our CCUS chain of business models works. The sources of funding are from taxpayers and consumers, but they're sources of revenue, and we expect all of the actual CapEx funding, or the vast majority of it, to come from the private sector. We do have a grant scheme, which is substantial. It's around £1 billion, but the revenue model is, so the main model is to support the revenue flows and for the bulk of the investment and upfront CapEx to come from the private sector. And so we're supporting the revenue flows through taxpayer and consumer money across all of these sectors, so industry and waste, hydrogen, and power generation and negative emissions. And that those users, that we call them, they then pay the T&S code, which is the transport and storage code. So the support of the transport and storage element of the CCUS chain is largely done by supporting the capture projects, and then they pay through to the transport and storage company. But we're very aware there's risks between those two entities, and so government's developed various mechanisms to ensure the risks on both sides are mitigated. And if, let's say, you're a private sector investor invested in a capture project, you are not unfairly penalised if the transport and storage project is delayed or has operational issues. And vice versa, on the transport and storage side, we have something called a revenue support agreement developed, and that is there to ensure the transport and storage infrastructure is able to receive its revenues regardless of the performance of the capture projects. And so there's government support right across the chain. How we've set it up, and this slide may look quite complicated, but I think the key point I wanted to make here is, we disaggregated the chain and got bespoke approaches to each sector, but we've also thought about how the interactions between those different support mechanisms work and made sure we've mitigated as much of the risk as possible. So looking beyond to the future, we've got this approach now, but in the longer term, we want to transition to a more self-sustaining CCUS market, driven more by carbon prices, and with less government and less consumer support coming in. And so we're embarking on something called a market transition phase from 2030 onwards, to set up a more commercial and competitive approach, looking at using some of the structures that have been successful in other sectors, such as allocation rounds, where contracts will be more instantaneously delivered, and it will be more repeatable, potentially through auction mechanisms and things like that. Whereas at the moment, we're in the domain of bilateral negotiations, which provides lots of benefits, but it does take more time and is less scalable. So I'll conclude with a few next steps. So lots has been achieved in 2023. We announced up to 20 billion of funding for early deployment of CCUS, and got into negotiations with the Track 1 projects, as well as launching Track 2. So the next steps are final investment decisions for the Track 1 projects, hopefully this year, delivering on that CCUS vision, and bringing forward the projects through that Track 1 expansion process to grow those Track 1 clusters even further and enhance their value for money, and engaging with those Track 2 clusters and starting to bring forward the projects that will attach to them. So in summary, CCUS is definitely a necessity rather than an option to meet our net zero targets, and it presents a huge opportunity for the UK and globally, and the UK is really keen to collaborate and work with our global partners on CCUS. We've got a clear set of ambitions in place, and that is kind of really driving investment and creating a thriving sector. And as I said, lots happened in 2023, but there's even more to look forward to in 2024 in the UK. So I hope I haven't gone significantly over time. I haven't been able to check whilst this has been on my screen, and welcome any questions.
Thank you for your enlightening speech, Mr. John. And here I've got some questions for you. The first question is, how does the UK foster international collaboration in the field of CCUS? And what opportunities exist for partnerships with Asia-Pacific nations?
Great, really welcome that question. First of all, we're committed to participation in lots of international multilateral fora, and really keen to be involved in those fora and help share our understanding of CCUS across the world. And so a few examples of that is the Clean Energy Ministerial for CCUS, the CEM, and there's plenty of Southeast Asian nations and Australia are members of the Clean Energy Ministerial, and the UK co-leads that alongside a couple of other countries. And that's a key international forum that's been around for quite a while, really bringing forward global collaboration and knowledge sharing on CCUS. There's a lot of work on research and things like that. Beyond that, we're also co-sponsor of something called the Karen Challenge, which some of you may have heard of, alongside countries like Indonesia. And that challenge is to store globally 1 gigaton of CO2 by 2030. So we're getting to the gigaton scales, which is exciting, but also a huge challenge for the sector and for the kind of international community to kind of respond to. So there's a couple of examples of multilateral collaboration, which I think is really important. But the UK is also proactively working with many Asian nations and with Australia on a bilateral basis, and we'll continue to do so. So very happy to foster that relationship further. And if anyone's got questions, please do be in touch. And we are in active kind of discussions with a lot of the relevant governmental kind of organizations in your countries.
Thank you for your answer, Mr. Joy. And the next question is, how does the UK's CCUS policy align with its broader net zero objectives? And what insights can be gained for Asia-Pacific nations with similar aspirations?
Sorry, that just broke up a tiny bit for me. I think that was about the environmental and social aspects. Is that correct?
Yes, Mr. Joy.
Okay, great. Sorry, my connection's maybe not brilliant, but I heard most of the question. So in terms of ensuring CCUS is done sustainably, it's not just about capturing the carbon, it's also about understanding the environmental and social impacts more locally. And the UK's got a very strong regulatory framework, especially on the environmental side. The environmental agency is heavily involved with the consenting of each of these projects, so they need to secure environmental consent from the Environment Agency before they can go ahead, which looks at things like water extraction, water quality, air quality, impacts on populations of different types of animals, and also on impacts on biodiversity and the natural environment. So the Environment Agency's got quite strict rules that you must adhere to and produce a clear environmental impact statement. And beyond that, there's something called OPRED, which is the Offshore Petroleum Regulator for Environment and Decommissioning. And that looks after all offshore projects in the oil and gas sector, but also beyond, and sets the standards, especially on an environmental basis, by which those projects must adhere to. And so this kind of ecosystem of different regulators is really important in the UK. Different countries will have their different approaches to that, but I think you can't deploy something like CCUS without thinking about the environmental impacts and making sure that the projects are developed responsibly and in the right locations. So there's certain areas in the UK that are protected for scientific interest or because they are particularly important to biodiversity and wildlife, and so there would be areas where it would not be desired to develop CCUS projects, capture projects. So I think that's really important, getting that balance right. It's not just developing everywhere at the biggest scale and the most rapid pace that you can. You need to find the balance with protecting the environment, but also the community. The local community is hosting these large projects. Some of these are very big onshore facilities and quite disruptive, or at least visually visible to those communities. So through the planning framework in the UK, there's a requirement for community engagement, and I think the best large-scale infrastructure projects engage the community early and work hard to get that buy-in with the local community that's hosting them, and that can be almost like a prerequisite for success as well, I think. So I think social aspects is all about community engagement and making sure the benefits of the project are distributed and do improve, local economy and local jobs. And then on the environmental side, it's more about having a kind of clear framework with rules and standards that the sector is kind of signed up to.
Thank you so much for your answer, Mr. John. And thank you again for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. And now we come to the end of our webinar. Once again, I want to express my profound gratitude to our esteemed speakers. Great appreciation to you guys for generously bringing us so many valuable insights. A sincere thank you also extends to our valued audience for participating in today's Impact webinar, Unlocking CCUS Landscape in Asia Pacific. Regarding today's video and presentation slides, we will share them both on our official website and on LinkedIn next Monday, along with some key insights from this webinar. If you have any further inquiries, please don't hesitate to reach out to me at betty@carboncaptureapac.com. Furthermore, I would like to remind you that this webinar serves as a virtual preview of our in-person event, Carbon Capture APAC 2024. This event is scheduled to be held from July 9th to 10th at Pan Pacific Hotel, Melbourne. We encourage you to secure your stand and be a part of this remarkable occasion. We eagerly anticipate the opportunity to meet you in person and engage in fruitful discussions. See you next time and take care.